Hello, dear listeners. This episode dives into the forgotten myths and whispered tales that time tried to bury. Stories of ancient powers, lingering curses, and heroes who faded into obscurity but left ripples that still haunt the present. Let's awaken the echoes of legends long past. I'm just dying to see what happens. Let's get started, shall we? The Harp of Hollow Vale. In a secluded valley shrouded in perpetual mist, there lay the ruins of Hollow Vale, a once thriving village, now reduced to crumbling stone and overgrown paths. At the heart of the ruins stood a lonely stone chapel, its steeple cracked and leaning, barely visible through the dense fog. Inside, sitting upon an altar worn smooth by time, rested a harp carved from silver and strung with threads as fine as moonlight. For centuries, travellers spoke of the harp, its strings untouched yet whispering a melody that drifted through the valley. Some said it was the voice of the wind, others the lament of the dead. Few dared approach, for the harp was rumoured to bear a curse. Those who heard its song would be drawn into the vale and never leave. Elena, a wandering musician, had heard these tales her entire life. A seeker of rare songs and ancient instruments, she refused to believe in curses and ghost stories. Armed with her lute and her unshakable curiosity, she ventured into the vale on a cold autumn morning, determined to learn the truth. As she approached the ruins, the air grew heavy, the mist coiling around her like a living thing. The faint sound of the harp reached her ears, soft, mournful, and impossibly beautiful. It called to her, its melody pulling her forward with a strange urgency. Inside the chapel, the harp gleamed in the dim light, untouched by time or decay. Elena hesitated only briefly before her curiosity overcame her caution. She reached out, plucking a single string. The note rang out, pure and haunting, and the mist around her seemed to shudder in response. As she played, the melody unfolded, intricate and otherworldly, filling the chapel with an ethereal glow. But as the final note faded, the mist grew darker, heavier. Shadows moved at the edges of her vision, and a voice, soft as a sigh, whispered, "Why have you come?" Elena turned to see a figure emerging from the mist, a woman draped in flowing, tattered robes, her face obscured by a veil. The figure held an air of sorrow, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. "I am Liara, the last bard of Hollow Vale," she said. "The harp you play was my gift to this village, a gift they turned into a weapon. They used its power to bind me here, silencing my voice and chaining my spirit to these ruins." Elena's heart raced, but her resolve did not falter. "What power does the harp hold, and why have you lingered here for so long?" Liara's veil shifted, revealing eyes like smouldering embers. "The harp draws life from those who hear its song, feeding the valley and preserving its cursed existence. I have waited for one who could play the melody in its entirety, unlocking the final verse and breaking the curse." Elena hesitated. The melody had been captivating, but she had felt its pull, the subtle draining of her strength with each note. "What happens if I complete the song?" "You will set me free," Liara said, "but the cost is steep. The valley will collapse, and all who remain here will vanish, including me." Elena considered her choices. She could leave now, allowing the veil to remain a haunted relic, or she could play, destroying the cursed valley, but granting Liara her long-awaited freedom. Her fingers found the strings again, and the melody returned, each note more powerful than the last. The mist grew darker, swirling violently, and the ruins trembled as if the valley itself were protesting. Liara stood motionless, her form flickering like a dying flame. The final note rang out, and the world seemed to shatter. The mist dissipated, the ruins crumbled, and Liara's voice rose in a triumphant, heartbreaking song before fading into silence. When Elena awoke, she was lying in a sunlit meadow. The vale was gone, replaced by rolling hills and wildflowers. The harp lay beside her, its silver dulled and its strings broken, but its curse was lifted. As she left the meadow, Elena carried with her not just the harp, but the story of Hollow Vale and its forgotten bard. She swore to share the tale, ensuring Liara's voice would never be silenced again. Ah, dear listeners, wasn't that a tale to pluck at your heartstrings? Poor Liara, stuck in a melody she couldn't escape. But hey, I guess the moral is, sometimes breaking free requires a little harp to heart. Ha! Now, don't stray too far. our next tale promises to be just as hauntingly harmonious. The Candlemaker's Curse. In a quiet, forgotten town nestled deep in the valley of shadowed pines, there lived an artisan known as the Candlemaker. His shop was small, tucked between two crumbling brick buildings, but its reputation was legendary. People travelled far and wide to buy his candles, which burned brighter, longer, and with scents that carried memories long forgotten. However, the Candlemaker had a peculiar rule. He never worked after dark. Every evening, as the clock struck 6, he would lock his doors, pull his shades, and extinguish every light within his shop. Rumours swirled about why, but no one dared ask. One autumn day, a wealthy merchant arrived in town. She was dressed in the finest silks and trailed by servants who carried her belongings in gilded trunks. She demanded an audience with the Candlemaker, pushing past the townsfolk waiting patiently in line. "I need a set of candles for my banquet tonight," she declared, her voice imperious. The Candlemaker nodded politely. "Of course, madam. Come back tomorrow, and they will be ready." The merchant frowned, her sharp features twisting with indignation. "Tomorrow? No, I need them now." He shook his head. "Good work takes time. I do not rush, and I do not work after sundown." Unaccustomed to refusal, the merchant scowled. "You will work tonight, or I will ruin your business. Everyone has a price." She placed a small velvet bag on his counter, and the chime of gold coins echoed through the shop. The Candlemaker's face darkened. "Some prices are too steep, madam. I suggest you leave." Angered, the merchant leaned forward. "Do not test me, old man. You have no idea who you are dealing with." The Candlemaker met her gaze, his eyes filled with something ancient and unyielding. "And you, madam, have no idea what you ask." The merchant stormed out, but her fury lingered in the air. That evening, as the Candlemaker prepared to close his shop, the bells above his door jingled. He turned, expecting to see a late customer, but the room was empty. The candles on the walls flickered, casting long, dancing shadows. He sighed, walking to the door to lock it, when a chill breeze swept through the shop, extinguishing the flames. Darkness fell like a heavy curtain, and a low whispering began, rising from the shadows. "You broke the pact, Candlemaker," the voices hissed. The old man froze. "I've done no such thing," he said, though his voice wavered. A shadow stretched across the floor, taking the shape of a gaunt, hooded figure. Its hollow eyes burned like dying embers. "The pact was sealed when you first lit the cursed wick, and now the debt must be paid." The Candlemaker swallowed hard. "I've kept my end of the bargain. I work by day, never by night. That was our agreement." The figure tilted its head. "Ah, but a soul entered your shop after dark. Whether by your hand or hers, the boundary was crossed." The Candlemaker's heart sank. The merchant, her intrusion had broken the rules. He fell to his knees. "Please, I beg you, spare me." The figure extended a skeletal hand, pointing to the shelves lined with candles. "One life for each flame you've sold. The debt cannot be undone." Desperate, the Candlemaker protested. "Those candles were made to bring light and joy. How can they be cursed?" The figure's laughter echoed, cold and hollow. "Each flame binds a piece of your soul to the darkness. Every flicker of light is a life stolen from the shadows. Did you truly think such gifts came without a cost?" The Candlemaker screamed as the shadows enveloped him, his cries fading into the void. When the sun rose the next morning, his shop was gone, leaving nothing but an empty lot where it once stood. But the candles remained. Scattered in homes across the valley, they burned with an unnatural brightness, casting shadows that seemed almost alive. And as each flame dwindled, its owner would vanish, leaving only a faint wisp of smoke behind. The merchant, too, disappeared, her servants finding only an untouched banquet table and a single, half-burned candle at its center. To this day, travelers speak of the Candlemaker's shop and the cursed flames that devoured the valley. They say, if you light one of his candles, you'd better pray you don't hear the whispers in the dark, or see the shadow of the Candlemaker coming to collect his due. Well, wasn't that a tale to light up your night? Or perhaps it left you feeling a little burned out? Either way, remember, dear listeners, when the shadows whisper, it's best to leave the flame alone. The Blacksmith's Last Wish. In a remote village hidden within the thickest of woods, there lived a blacksmith known for his remarkable skill in crafting weapons. Henry, a quiet, solitary man, had poured years into his forge, creating swords that glittered like starlight, daggers as sharp as winter's breath, and armor rumored to be unbreakable. Yet despite his fame, he longed for something beyond metal and flame. He yearned for companionship, a family to share the warmth of his hearth. One fateful night, a wanderer arrived at Henry's forge. Cloaked in tattered robes and carrying a faintly glowing lantern, the stranger's eyes gleamed with a strange knowingness. Henry welcomed the traveller, offering him warmth and food, in exchange for news from beyond the village. But instead of news, the stranger offered something far more tempting: a deal. "I know the longing in your heart," said the traveller, his voice smooth as shadow. "For a price, I can grant you a family of your own, a child bound to your very soul." Desperate, Henry agreed without hesitation, for the price was not his soul, but his craft. From that moment, the stranger warned, he could forge only one more item. After that, the fires of his forge would die, and his skill would leave him. The next morning, Henry woke to find a small bundle at the edge of his forge, a newborn, with eyes as dark as the midnight sky, and a cry that pierced the morning like steel. Overwhelmed with joy, he named her Mara, vowing to love her with all the warmth his forge once held. As the years passed, Mara grew into a girl as radiant as the embers that glowed within her father's workshop. But Henry's skill had waned. Each time he tried to forge, his once steady hands shook, and the metal resisted him. Determined to leave a legacy for his daughter, he decided to use his last skillful breath to forge a blade of unmatched power. Night after night, he worked tirelessly, pouring his soul into the blade's metal, heating it with memories and shaping it with hopes for Mara's future. It was a blade unlike any other, gleaming with a life of its own, seeming to pulse like a heartbeat. When the blade was finished, Mara found it before her father did, entranced by its beauty. As she picked it up, a chill spread through her body, and her eyes filled with visions, shadows of the past and whispers of regret. She saw her father's hands, calloused and bleeding, each stroke filled with a desperate hope for her future. And she saw the stranger, watching from the edge of the forest, his gaze dark and triumphant. Just then, Henry stumbled upon Mara, her small hands gripping the blade, her face pale as she turned to him. "Father," she whispered, her voice trembling, "why does it feel like this blade is alive?" Realizing the weight of what he'd done, Henry felt his heart drop. He'd poured every ounce of his remaining life into the blade, binding his own soul to it. In his desperation for a legacy, he'd sacrificed his own future, leaving Mara alone to wield the burden. The next morning, Henry was gone, leaving only a faint trail of ash near the forge. Mara, now bound to the blade, felt an unbreakable bond to the forge, as though her father's spirit lingered there, guiding her hands. She inherited his skill, but each creation came at a price. For each piece she forged, a piece of her essence fused with the metal, and whispers told that one day, she too would meet the fate of her father, bound to the last thing she crafted, forever a part of the forge. And so, Mara became the village's next blacksmith, her forge alight with embers that danced like ghosts in the night. And the villagers knew, when they heard the soft, rhythmic clang of metal at dusk, that Henry's spirit lived on, not in the blade he left behind, but in the hands of the daughter who carried on his legacy. Well, wasn't that a cutting-edge tale? Truly a forging of fate and fire. But don't worry, dear listeners, I've still got more stories in the furnace, ones that will really steel your nerves. The unwritten chapters. In the heart of an unassuming suburban neighborhood sat a quaint, ivy-covered library. The Whispering Grove Public Library was known not just for its vast collection of books, but also for its peculiar reputation. Its archives seemed to grow larger every year, though no new donations were made. Amelia, a young literature professor, had always been drawn to its charm. On one quiet evening, as golden sunlight faded into twilight, she decided to explore a restricted section she'd often heard whispers about, the archives of the unwritten chapters. The librarian spoke of it in hushed tones, claiming it held works that no author had ever completed. Upon entering the section, Amelia noticed the air grew colder, the lights dimmer. The shelves, towering and ancient, bore books with no titles. Intrigued, she pulled one from the shelf. The pages were empty, save for faint indentations, as though the words were erased rather than never written. As she traced the marks, her mind filled with vivid scenes: a lone traveller scaling a cliff, a bustling marketplace in an alien world, and a love story that ended before it began. She felt her heart racing as her imagination filled the gaps. Then she turned the page, and her breath caught. A new line appeared before her eyes. Amelia turned the page, and the story began to unfold. The words mirrored her actions, narrating her own experience in the library. Startled, she dropped the book, and it fell open to another page. She stepped into the world beyond, leaving her old life behind. Suddenly, the room seemed to ripple around her. The bookshelves dissolved, and she stood on the edge of a misty moor, the skies dark and foreboding. A quill appeared in her hand, and a voice, neither male nor female, echoed through the air. "Welcome, author. Here your thoughts create the world, and your pen shapes its fate. But beware, every story demands sacrifice. Will you write, knowing the price you may pay?" Amelia hesitated, but curiosity overpowered fear. She began to write. With every stroke of the quill, the moor transformed. A castle rose in the distance, a forest came alive, and characters materialized before her. They looked at her with pleading eyes, desperate for a resolution to their lives. But as she wrote, a sharp pain stabbed her chest. The voice returned. "The ink is your lifeblood, author. The more you write, the less of you remains in your world." Realizing the stakes, Amelia tried to stop, but the quill moved of its own accord, dragging her hand across the page. She watched in horror as the characters' stories grew darker, more perilous, reflecting her inner turmoil. Finally, with the last drop of ink, the quill stopped. Amelia found herself back in the library, clutching a completed manuscript. The once empty book now bore a title, The Unwritten Chapters. But she felt hollow, her memories fragmented. She tried to leave the library, but the doors wouldn't open. She realized, with dawning horror, she had become part of the archives. Her story was written, but she could never leave. From that day on, new visitors to the restricted section sometimes heard faint whispers among the shelves. "Finish what we cannot." Those who dared to open the books found themselves drawn into unwritten worlds, always at the risk of writing themselves out of existence. To this day, the library grows, one chapter at a time. Well, my dearest listeners, we've reached the final chapter of tonight's tales. I hope you've enjoyed wandering through these chilling stories, where the threads of fate, fear, and fantasy wove a tapestry of intrigue. But the story doesn't have to end here. If you've been captivated by my tales, remember you can find my books, filled with even more eerie delights, on Amazon. They're waiting for you to turn the pages and lose yourself in the shadows. For those craving even more, join me on my Facebook page, Luna Parnell's Written Works. It's the perfect place to connect with other story lovers, share your thoughts, and perhaps even suggest ideas for future episodes. And if you truly can't get enough, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/lunastreasures. There you'll find exclusive stories, behind-the-scenes content, and sneak peeks at my upcoming works. Until next time, my friends, may your nights be filled with whispers of wonder, and your dreams carry you to worlds untold. This is Luna, bidding you farewell, for now. Keep your lights dim, your imaginations wild, and your hearts open to the mysteries of the night.